What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here. So today I wanted to talk about a really underrated DPS option that I don't see anyone talking about. I will talk about use case scenarios for the combo and whether it could actually be a viable DPS strategy come Lightfall. So without further ado, let's get into it. You see, a lot of people are hyping up Wendigo with autoloading holster and explosive light, and doing Izanagi swaps in between. Now, there's no doubt this could be a meta option come Lightfall, as heavy GLs are getting a 20% damage increase, and Izanagi's burden is also getting a damage buff with the blanket buff coming to kinetic weapons. So we'll see how that DPS shakes out. A Godroll Clown Cartridge rocket launcher paired with a Galahorn is the current DPS meta, and I honestly don't see that going anywhere. They hit super hard and have more forgiveness and ease of use than swapping between hitting GL shots and an Izanagi crit. But I never see anyone talking about fusion rifles. And before you laugh at me, let me explain. Your fusion rifles need two exact perks to make this strategy viable. I'm talking about cornered and surrounded. Specifically, enhanced cornered and enhanced surrounded. Cornered states that you get faster charge time or draw time when surrounded by combatants. You only need to be within 15 meters of two enemies to proc this perk, so it is fairly forgiving. It grants a 0.85x charge time multiplier, so basically it allows us to shoot our shots faster. But unlike things like accelerated coils or charge time masterworks, it does not affect our damage. It's just a straight up bump to our DPS. But speaking of charge time masterworks and accelerated coils, that is what you want to craft these guns with. Yes, you will do less damage per shot, so total damage overall will suffer a little bit, but faster charge time does increase damage per second, and we are trying to get as much DPS as possible here, as we are speculating about meta DPS strats for the upcoming Lightfall raid. So next, let's look at the next Godroll perk to make our fusion rifle a DPS monster, and that is Surrounded. Surrounded gains bonus damage when 3 or more enemies are in close proximity. This one is not as forgiving as Cornered, as you have to be within 8 meters of 3 enemies to proc this. Now, before you say that is unrealistic, you could proc this extremely easily on both Templar and Atheon in the Vault of Glass. And the most recent new raid, Vow of the Disciple, this would slap on the Caretaker on the close plates as there are enemies all around. And in Kingsfall, I actually use these weapons on Golgoroth. I would say roughly 50% of raid bosses you are going to damage will have enemies around them, and I expect we could have similar enemy dense encounters in the new raid. So proccing Surrounded is not out of the question. And a big bonus to using a fusion rifle for DPS is it is much more forgiving than snipers or slug shotguns. A boss like Atheon moves around a ton and is quite hard to hit with precision weapons, so instead of relegating someone to Divinity, just have a Hunter tether for a bigger damage debuff and then everyone can put in DPS. So this perk combination can roll on 2 fusion rifles that I know of, and both are raid weapons. Deliverance is a stasis precision frame in the kinetic slot from Vow of the Disciple, and Midas Reckoning is an arc high impact from the Kingsfall raid. You want the weapon pattern for both of these, as Enhanced Surrounded is a straight up weapon boost. It takes the damage increase from 40 to 47%, which is significant. And you used to have to rock Surrounded Spec, but now that extra damage is built in since this got a pseudo buff when Bungie made that change a little while back where all the spec mods just became base. On top of this, it got another buff when the full auto option was added to the game, as now you can just hold the trigger and don't have to time your charges. You'll just always get optimal DPS. So now, finally, let's look at the numbers. A base Deliverance hits for 6137 damage per bolt and shoots off 7 bolts. That is 42,959 damage per shot. One thing to note is all the testing was done on rolls with accelerated coils and a charge time masterwork, because as mentioned before, that will give the highest DPS. And one final thing to note is we have no major or boss spec mods equipped, so for DPS you would put those on for an additional 7.5% damage. So we can hold 6 shots in the mag, so 1 mag total damage is 257,754, and it takes 6.867 seconds to fire off these shots. So that will give you a DPS of 37,535. Not a great DPS to be completely honest, especially for a special weapon. But that is the base version of this gun. So now let's look at the souped up version. With Surrounded procced, we hit for 9,021 damage per bolt, or 63,147 damage per shot. So the total damage here is 378,882, and it takes us 6.05 seconds to shoot off a full mag with Cornered procced. So the DPS here is 62,625. That is about 67% more DPS that you get when you are surrounded by 3 or more enemies. That is very significant. And again, we can push that number higher by using a Boss Spec for 7.5% more damage, so the DPS would be 67,322. That is great special DPS. So now let's look at Midas Reckoning. I'll be honest, I don't love the feel of high impacts, but I will make a case for why this one could be better to use over Deliverance. So at base, it hits for 10,165 damage per bolt and shoots off 5 bolts. So it hits for 50,825 damage per shot. It holds 5 in the mag, so the total damage will be 254,125 damage per mag. And it takes 6.6 seconds to shoot off 5 rounds for a base DPS of 38,504. So now let's look at the souped up version once again. That version hits for 14,943 damage per bolt, or 74,715 damage per shot. In a 5-shot mag, that is 373,575 damage, and it takes 5.95 seconds to shoot off 5 shots for a DPS of 62,786. So the Deliverance and the Midas are neck and neck for DPS essentially, so which is better to use? Well, in my opinion, you want the Midas, and here is why. In Lightfall, heavy grenade launchers are getting a 20% buff, and this buff also applies to Anarchy, and Anarchy is an arc weapon. Now, Bungie has told us traditional Font of Might mod is going away with the mod system changes. However, as I understand it, you can still choose to buff a certain element of weapon even if your subclass doesn't match. Where right now your subclass has to match a weapon damage type to take advantage of Font of Might. So you could double dip on arc damage by pairing this with Anarchy. And Anarchy is about to do 20% more boss damage in Lightfall. So let's look at those theoretical numbers. So when stuck to an enemy, Anarchy lasts 10 seconds. If we shoot a boss with it, it hits for 681 impact damage and then ticks for 4,744 damage. And 2 shots will deal 9,494 damage per tick. It does 19 of these ticks in 10 seconds, and the final tick does a bit less damage. On Carl, the last tick did 5,051 damage instead of 7,103, so that is 71% of a regular damage tick. So if we apply that to the boss in the Lost Sector that we got the boss damage numbers from, then it would hit for 6751 damage when 2 Anarchy shots are applied. If we add up all this damage, the initial impact damage, the 19 ticks of full damage, and the final slightly less final damage tick, we get 97,568 damage from Anarchy in 10 seconds, for a boss DPS of 9,757 damage. We multiply the damage by 1.2% because we will get a damage buff to Anarchy in Lightfall, and now Anarchy has a DPS of 11,708. So your DPS phase would look like this. You would stick the boss with 2 Anarchy shots, swap to Midas, which takes 5.95 seconds to shoot off your whole mag, reload, reapply 2 Anarchy shots as they will be about to wear off, and then start shooting Midas again. This is a better DPS option than everyone using Witherhoard because only one fireteam member gets the blight damage over time with Witherhoard, unfortunately. Though Witherhoard is a great general purpose play leading up to the boss damage phase. But where does that bring our totals? Let's just do Midas because it is arc, so whatever the new Font of Might perk is, it might be able to take advantage of that. So Midas 1 mag DPS is 62,786 and 67,495 with a Boss Spec, and Anarchy's DPS after Lightfall will be 11,078. The combo together will be 78,573 DPS. This is extremely good DPS. Yes, it takes 2 weapons to pull this off, but it is extremely ammo efficient for DPS, and it can take advantage of whatever the new Font of Might system will be. And we don't yet know if that will stack with Radiant or Weapons of Light, but if it does, then that will definitely be worth running. Anyways, I just wanted to get this information out there as, like I said, I haven't seen a lot of people talking about this Godroll fusion rifle combination. Maybe it is because for it to reach its max potential, you have to craft a raid weapon, so not a lot of people have access to it in its final form, and linears have dominated the DPS space for so long that no one has stopped to consider this combination. As well, Warpriest does not have enemies around during DPS, and Oryx is far away, so linears are definitely optimal. So this would only be good on Golgoroth in the latest raid. Again, this combination does depend on encounter design, as you need at least 3 enemies around you for it to be effective. And you also need a relatively close boss so you don't get damage fall off on your fusion rifle. Again, picture the Atheon encounter for an optimal scenario to use this. So adding this in post-script, I'm finishing editing this after having worked a night shift, and I just had a terrible realization that I did test all the numbers on the fusion rifles with a major spec on. Rather than redoing all the numbers and voice recording for the video, I watched it back and I do have the base DPS for everything I talked about, but that is actually the DPS with a spec mod on. So for the base numbers, just reduce everything by 7.5%. Here are the proper DPS numbers in a scenario with Boss Spec. I really hope you watch to the end so that I didn't mislead anyone. I should have been more careful and I really do regret this error, but my life has been insane lately and I do not have time to re-edit everything this weekend, unfortunately. Regardless, this combo still does awesome DPS and I can't wait to try it in Lightfall. Anyways, I do hope this video was helpful to you, and if it was, then consider liking the video and subscribing for more. I'm very much looking forward to Lightfall and trying out a whole new sandbox and weapon meta. Finally, if you made it this far, then I just want to thank you so much for watching. Take care.